My name is Edward Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and if you look at me now, you wouldn't see much more than a worn-out man with gray hair, shaky hands, and a heart that doesn't always beat the way it should. But behind the wrinkles and the pills in my pocket, there's a story I never thought I'd tell. A story about sacrifice, about a son who became everything I once dreamed, and about the cost of chasing that dream. When Ryan was little, he lived with a football in his hands. Other kids played with toy trucks, but not him. He'd toss that ball in the yard until the sun went down. Margaret, my wife, used to laugh and call him our little quarterback. I can still hear her voice when I close my eyes. She believed in him with every breath, and so did I. But believing costs money. Training camps, gear, traveling to tournaments, it all adds up. I was a mechanic with a small shop, and work wasn't always steady. So I did what fathers do. I worked nights at the mill after long days fixing cars. I sold my shop when bills piled too high. And when that wasn't enough, I signed papers I barely understood and mortgaged the roof over our heads. Margaret tried to carry the load too. She sewed clothes for neighbors, baked pies to sell at church fundraisers. There were days she skipped meals so Ryan could eat well before a game. She never complained. She'd just smile at me in the quiet of the night and say, "One day he'll thank us." But life has a way of taking what matters most. Margaret never saw that day. Cancer came fast, like a storm nobody saw coming. I held her hand in the hospital while Ryan was away at college, chasing the dream we had built together. Her last words to me were about him. "Promise me, Ed. Promise me he'll never forget where he came from." I promised. God knows I promised. After she passed, it was just me and the mortgage. My body ached, my heart grew weaker, but I kept pushing. I drove Ryan to practice, even when the gas tank was near empty. I slept in old trucks while waiting for him to finish training. Every sacrifice felt worth it because I believed, because Margaret believed, that Ryan would carry our love with him into whatever future he found. And he did find it. The boy who once played in the dirt yards of our neighborhood became a star under stadium lights, drafted into the NFL, cheered by thousands, his name flashing across screens I never thought I'd own. The first time I watched him run onto that field, I cried like a child. Not because of the fame, not because of the money, but because I thought he'd remember. I thought he'd look into the stands and see his old man, standing proud with Margaret's memory in my chest. But people change when the lights shine too bright. Fame doesn't just lift, it blinds. And as Ryan climbed, I began to feel something I never expected from my own son. Distance. He stopped calling. He stopped visiting. And when he did, there was always someone else around. A manager, an agent, people who looked at me like I was a piece of old furniture left in the corner. Still, I held on to my promise. I kept every receipt, every contract, every letter from coaches who knew the truth that without us, without Margaret and me, Ryan would have had nothing. I didn't keep them out of anger. I kept them because I thought, someday he might want to remember. I didn't know then that those papers, the proof of every sacrifice, would become the very thing that ended the career I bled for.
When Ryan finally made it into the NFL, it felt like the whole town knew before I did. Neighbors knocked on my door. Reporters showed up on the street where nobody had ever cared to drive before. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it, the payoff. The years of sweat, the nights I spent with grease on my hands and exhaustion in my bones, the promise I made to Margaret, it all seemed to come alive in that one headline: Hayes drafted into the NFL. I wish Margaret had been there. God, she would have cried louder than the crowd. She believed in him even more than I did, and her absence cut deeper that day than ever before. I stood in the middle of our small living room, holding the newspaper, staring at Ryan's smile. He looked so young, so full of fire. I told myself, that's our boy. That's our sacrifice made flesh. The first season was a whirlwind. Ryan called often. At first, he told me about the practices, the teammates, the games. I kept every recording of his voice on that old answering machine, just to hear him say, "Hey, Dad." But as the games grew bigger and the contracts piled higher, those calls came less and less. The boy who used to run into the kitchen shouting for his mom's cooking now dined with sponsors, politicians, and men in tailored suits who spoke in numbers I could barely imagine. It was around then that I met him, the agent. He wore confidence like a suit, slick and pressed, his smile a weapon sharper than any knife. He shook my hand once, firm but cold, and said, "Mr. Hayes, Ryan is destined for greatness. We'll make sure his image reflects that." His words stayed with me. His image. Not his talent, not his character, just an image. I watched the transformation happen slowly, like rust creeping across metal. Ryan's interviews stopped mentioning home, or me, or his mother. When journalists asked about his childhood, he'd laugh it off, say something vague like, "I made myself through hard work." He never spoke her name, Margaret, the woman who sold pies to fund his cleats. He never spoke mine. It cut deep the first time I heard it. I made myself. 3 words that erased decades of sacrifice. 3 words that buried his mother twice. Still, I tried to convince myself it was just the business talking. The agent probably told him what to say. "People love a self-made man," I overheard him telling Ryan once at a dinner I wasn't meant to attend. I sat there, invisible, while he spoke about branding, endorsements, the kind of life they wanted to build for him. Ryan nodded like an obedient student, soaking up every word. I saw the pride in Ryan's eyes now, not pride in what he'd achieved, but how the world looked at him. He wore suits Margaret could never have dreamed of affording, shoes worth more than the truck I drove him to practices in. People treated him like royalty, and in their admiration, I began to see something else in him. Shame. Shame of where he came from. Shame of me. The moment it truly sunk in was at a banquet after his second season. They called him to the stage to accept an award, and he stood tall, flashing that perfect smile. The host asked about his inspiration. My heart pounded. I waited for his answer, my chest swelling, Margaret's memory burning in me. And Ryan said, clear as day, "I inspired myself. I've always been self-driven." The room erupted in applause. My world collapsed in silence. I clapped too, because what else was I supposed to do? But in that moment, I understood. My son had risen higher than I'd ever dreamed, and he had climbed so far that he no longer saw the ground he came from. He no longer saw me. And the worst part? That was only the beginning. I'll never forget the first time I truly saw the agent for what he was. His name was Victor Lane, and he carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no in his life. Tailored suits, gold watch, hair slicked back like he'd stepped out of a magazine. But beneath the polish was something colder, something that made my skin crawl. Victor didn't just manage Ryan, he owned the air around him. He spoke for him, decided for him, even smiled for him when cameras flashed. People thought Ryan had grown into confidence, but I knew better. That confidence wasn't his. It was manufactured. It was Victor whispering in his ear. At first, I tried to convince myself he wasn't so bad. Ryan needed guidance, I thought. He was young, and the world of contracts and endorsements could swallow anyone whole. But it didn't take long to see Victor's real hand at work. One evening, I sat quietly at a dinner they held after a big win. I wasn't at the head table, just tucked in the back, the way I usually was. But I could hear them, Victor and Ryan, talking just a few seats ahead. "You've got to shed that small-town image, Ryan," Victor said, swirling wine in his glass. "People want heroes, not farm boys with grease under their nails. You need to look untouchable, like you built yourself from nothing. That's the brand we're selling." Ryan nodded, eager like a boy still trying to impress a teacher. My stomach turned. That farm boy with grease he was talking about was me. The nights I worked under the hood of old trucks while Ryan slept, dreaming his big dreams. That was the grease Victor wanted scrubbed away. From that moment on, I watched Ryan's answers and interviews shift more and more. The agent had given him a script, and he followed it like gospel. He stopped mentioning his roots entirely. His mother's name vanished from his story, like she had never existed. And when I brought it up once, in private, Ryan just sighed. "Dad, nobody wants to hear about that stuff. Victor says it doesn't sell." Didn't sell. As if his mother's sacrifice was a cheap trinket in some store window, marked down because it wasn't shiny enough. It wasn't only what Victor said, it was how he looked at me. He never spoke directly to me unless he had to, but when he did, his words carried the kind of polite contempt you can't mistake. "Mr. Hayes," he said once, leaning in close during an event, "Ryan is a star now. These environments can be difficult for someone like you. Don't worry, though. We'll take good care of him." Someone like me. I wanted to hit him, but I didn't. Instead, I kept quiet. I'd learned that silence has its own kind of strength. I'd kept receipts, contracts, letters, all the forgotten truths that Victor couldn't touch. He thought I was invisible. He thought I'd fade into the background, too old and too broken to matter. But I was watching, and I was remembering. The more Victor pushed Ryan to erase his past, the more Ryan began to treat me like a ghost. At first, it was little things, forgetting to return calls, leaving me off guest lists. Then it grew. At one charity gala, Ryan actually introduced Victor as the man who made me who I am today. I nearly choked on my drink. That was when I knew Victor wasn't just guiding Ryan's career. He was rewriting his story. And in that new story, there was no Margaret, no me, no sacrifices, just Ryan sculpted by Victor's hand. I told myself I could endure it, that maybe one day Ryan would remember. But deep down, I knew men like Victor never let go until they're forced. And I wasn't done yet.
It started small, the way cracks in a wall do. At first, you hardly notice them. A skipped phone call here, a forgotten invitation there. I told myself he was busy. NFL schedules were brutal, after all. Practices, games, flights, interviews. I excused him because that's what fathers do. We forgive. But the cracks spread. One night, Ryan invited me to a charity event. At least that's what I thought. I showed up in my best suit, the one Margaret had once patched at the elbow. It didn't fit me quite right anymore, but it was all I had. I sat at a corner table, quiet, proud just to be in the same room as my son. When Ryan took the stage to speak, my chest swelled. He thanked his teammates, his coaches, even his agent, Victor. Then he said the words that cut me deeper than anything I had ever heard. I made myself into who I am today. The room applauded. Cameras flashed. I sat there, invisible. My hands trembled, but I kept clapping, because what else was I supposed to do? Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. Promise me he'll never forget. But he already had. Afterward, I tried to approach him. "Ryan," I said softly, "maybe you could have mentioned your mother. She'd have liked that." He sighed, annoyed, and glanced at Victor before answering. "Dad, nobody wants to hear about the past. Don't make things awkward." Awkward. My love, my sacrifices, my wife's memory. He called them awkward. It didn't stop there. At smaller gatherings, I noticed how he introduced me. Once to a group of sponsors, he gestured toward me with a half smile and said, "That's just my dad. Don't mind him. He's old-fashioned." Laughter followed. Light, but sharp. I felt my face burn. Another time, at a post-game dinner, someone asked about his upbringing. Ryan chuckled and said, "Let's just say I had to climb out of nowhere. I didn't exactly come from much." His words hung heavy. I wasn't much. Margaret wasn't much. We were the nowhere he had to climb out of. People laughed, toasted to his resilience, while I sat in silence, chewing food that tasted like dust. The worst came at a private party Victor hosted. The room was full of polished men and women, people who spoke in investments and endorsements. I sat near the back, nursing a glass of water because I couldn't afford the drinks they poured. When someone asked about his family, Ryan waved a hand dismissively. "My dad? He's nobody. Just a mechanic who barely scraped by. Victor's the one who made me who I am." Nobody. That word hit me like a hammer to the chest. For a moment, I thought my heart had finally given out. My vision blurred, my hands shook. I pressed my palm against the table to steady myself. I wanted to stand, to shout, to remind him of the nights Margaret went hungry so he could eat, of the hours I worked double shifts to buy his cleats, of the promise I made to his dying mother. But I didn't. I stayed seated, silent, because silence has weight. Silence remembers. And I knew something Ryan didn't, that I had proof. Contracts, letters, Margaret's final words on paper. I had carried them, not to use, but to preserve the truth. That night, though, as I lay awake listening to my heart struggle against my chest, I realized something. Maybe one day, silence wouldn't be enough. Maybe one day, I would have to speak. And that day was coming faster than I thought.
The invitation came in the mail, thick cardstock with gold lettering. Super Bowl party, hosted by Ryan Hayes. My son's name in bold, the kind of print that screams wealth and power. I turned the card over in my hands, wondering if he had sent it himself or if it was just Victor's idea. Still, I went. A father always goes. The hotel ballroom was like nothing I'd ever stepped into before. Chandeliers dripping with crystals, tables lined with white cloth, waiters carrying trays of drinks I couldn't pronounce. Screens the size of billboards played highlights of Ryan's career. His face was everywhere, on banners, on posters, on the lips of every guest. I felt out of place the moment I walked in. My suit was the same patched one Margaret had once fixed years ago. It looked dull next to the sheen of tuxedos and sequin dresses, but I told myself it didn't matter. I was his father. I had every right to be there. At first, no one noticed me. People brushed past as if I were just another hotel worker. When I finally found Ryan, he was surrounded by politicians, sponsors, and teammates. I waited at the edge of the circle, smiling faintly,
hoping he'd catch my eye. He did, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy I once drove to practice. But then Victor leaned in, whispered something, and Ryan's expression hardened. He gave me the kind of nod you give a stranger, nothing more. The night rolled on. Laughter, glasses clinking, cameras flashing. My chest tightened, not just from the heart that betrayed me more often these days, but from the weight of being invisible in a room where my sacrifices had built the very man they celebrated. Then came the moment. Ryan stood to give a toast. The crowd gathered, raising glasses. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, every inch the hero they wanted him to be. "To success," he began, his voice carrying easily. "To the journey that brought me here and those who believed in me along the way." Applause followed. I almost smiled until his next words cut me down. "You know, people always ask me about my past. Truth is, I built myself. No handouts, no safety nets, just hard work and determination." Cheers erupted. Glasses clinked. And then, like twisting the knife, he added, "Some people tried to hold me back. Some were just burdens. But I made it anyway." Burden. The word rang in my ears, louder than the applause. I felt the blood drain from my face. Around me, people nodded, admiring his grit, his independence. None of them knew he was talking about me, his own father, sitting just a few feet away. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest ached, sharp and unrelenting. My hand trembled as I gripped the edge of the table. A waiter glanced at me, concerned, but I waved him off. In that moment, humiliation burned hotter than the pain in my chest. My son, the boy Margaret had believed in, the man I had bled for, had just erased me in front of the world. But he didn't know something. He didn't know that silence is not the same as weakness. Because tucked inside my jacket, folded neat and safe, were the letters, the contracts, and Margaret's words, proof of everything he wanted to forget. As the crowd cheered and Ryan raised his glass, I stayed seated. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. This was the moment Margaret's promise echoed in my ears, louder than ever. Promise me he'll never forget where he came from. And I knew then, as I watched him bask in the glow of false glory, that I was done being silent. The time was coming, sooner than Ryan could imagine.
The ballroom buzzed after Ryan's toast, but all I could hear was that one word echoing in my head: burden. I sat there, my chest tight, my hand trembling against the glass of water I hadn't touched. For years I had stayed quiet. I had swallowed insult after insult, believing that maybe silence itself was a kind of strength. But Margaret's voice wouldn't leave me. Promise me he'll never forget. So I stood. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? I was just an old man in a worn suit, a shadow in a room full of light. But when I cleared my throat, the microphone picked up the sound. Heads turned, cameras shifted. The music dimmed. "Ryan," I said, my voice unsteady but louder than I expected, "I've been listening to you call yourself self-made for years. I've watched you erase your mother, erase me, erase the truth. But tonight, in front of everyone who praises you, I'm going to remind you of something you can't erase." The room hushed. Ryan's smile faltered. Victor shifted in his chair, whispering urgently, but I didn't stop. My hand slipped inside my jacket and I pulled out a folder, worn from decades of being carried, pages yellowed but unbroken.
"These," I said, holding them high, "are the contracts from your first training camps, the mortgage papers I signed so you could play, every debt I took on, every receipt of every sacrifice. Without these, there would have been no dream to chase." I opened one page, reading aloud a line from a coach's letter. "Ryan shows promise, but it is his father's unyielding support that makes his future possible." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sponsors and executives leaned forward, suddenly less amused. Ryan's face went pale. "Dad, stop." But I wasn't finished. From the folder, I pulled a second envelope sealed with the delicate handwriting of a woman gone too soon. My hands shook as I opened it, but my voice carried steady when I spoke. "This," I said, "is your mother's letter, the one she wrote before she died." Gasps filled the room. I unfolded the paper and read, "Ryan, if you ever forget who you are, remember this. Your father gave you everything. He is the reason you stand where you stand. Don't ever be ashamed of him. Honor him the way he has honored you." My voice cracked, but I finished the line. The room was silent now, so silent I could hear my own heart pounding. I let the letter fall back into the envelope, then pulled one last page from the folder. A contract, one Ryan had signed when he was still underage, when I was his legal guardian. My finger tapped the clause I had memorized long ago. "And here," I said, my voice sharpening, "is proof that not only did I finance your beginning, but legally I still hold rights in your career. Rights you and your agent conveniently ignored. Rights that show your entire empire rests on a foundation built by the man you now call a burden." Victor's face drained of color. Whispers turned into a low roar. Some of the sponsors shifted uncomfortably, others pulled out phones. The image they had bought, the untouchable star who built himself from nothing, was crumbling right before their eyes. I looked straight at Ryan, my son who once tossed a ball in the yard while his mother clapped from the porch. His lips parted, but no words came. I closed the folder slowly, my hand steady now. "You can erase me in your speeches, Ryan. You can forget your mother in your interviews, but the truth doesn't vanish just because you bury it. Tonight, I've unburied it." The ballroom was silent, and for the first time in years, I felt Margaret beside me, her hand warm in mine. For a long second after I closed the folder, the ballroom was silent. You could have heard a glass drop. Ryan stood frozen at the head table, his champagne flute half raised, his mouth open but speechless. The boy who once filled stadiums with noise couldn't find a single word. Then the whispers started, first in the back, then rolling forward like a tide. Sponsors leaned toward one another, brows furrowed. Executives pulled out their phones, scrolling frantically, no doubt searching for confirmation. Every eye turned from Ryan's polished suit to me, the man he had tried to erase. Victor was the first to react. He pushed up from his chair, his face slick with forced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice sharp, "this is nothing more than—" I raised the contract again. My finger pressed the clause. "Read it," I interrupted, my voice louder than his. "Read what your golden boy signed when he was 17, when I was still his guardian. Read how every step he took was backed by my sacrifice." Gasps spread through the room. Victor's mask cracked. He stammered, That clause is outdated. It doesn't mean anything now." But the damage was done. People in expensive suits were already whispering words like breach and legal exposure. I saw one of Ryan's sponsors slip his phone back into his pocket and stand up quietly, leaving without shaking a single hand. Ryan finally found his voice, but it wasn't the confident tone of a star. It was smaller, fragile, almost boyish. "Dad, why are you doing this?" I met his eyes. For a moment, I almost saw the little boy again, the one who tossed a football until the sun went down. But the weight of years, of silence and humiliation, anchored me. "I'm not doing this to ruin you, son," I said evenly. "I'm doing this to remind you, to remind them, to remind her." I lifted Margaret's letter, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. She believed you'd honor your family. You dishonored her instead. The room turned colder than ice. No one clapped. No one laughed. Ryan's teammates shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. A senator who had been bragging about Ryan minutes earlier cleared his throat and walked away. Victor tried again, his voice desperate now. This man is unwell. Look at him. He's old, bitter, confused. He's trying to drag Ryan down because he couldn't achieve anything himself. I smiled faintly because I had expected it. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a faded photograph. Margaret, Ryan, and me, standing on the front porch of our little house. Ryan in his first jersey, his arms around both of us. The smile of a boy who once knew who carried him. I held it up. If sacrifice is nothing, if love is nothing, then tell them who bought that jersey. Tell them who drove you to every game. Tell them who sat in that hospital room when your mother died. Tell them, Ryan. His lips quivered. No words came. The room didn't need them. They had already judged. I heard chairs scraping, voices murmuring about contracts voided and reputation risk. The sponsors were leaving, one by one. Reporters snapped photos, recording every crack in the image Ryan and Victor had spent years polishing. Ryan sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Victor stood rigid beside him, his smile gone, his future with it. And me, I slid the folder back into my jacket. My hands were steady. For years I had carried those papers like a weight, unsure if I'd ever need them. Tonight, they weren't just papers. They were the truth. The empire built on lies had just collapsed, not with a bang, but with a silence heavier than any cheer.
I didn't wait for the party to end. I didn't need to. The ending was already written the moment I closed that folder. The chandeliers still glowed, the music still played faintly, but the air had shifted. The laughter that once filled the room had died, replaced by whispers and footsteps heading for the exits. Ryan sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed, while Victor stood beside him, whispering frantic words that fell flat against the silence. Their empire of polished smiles and perfect branding had cracked open in front of everyone, and there was no putting it back together. I slid the envelope with Margaret's letter back into my jacket, close to my heart. I didn't read it for them. I read it for her, for me, for the promise I made as she lay fading from this world. Promise me he'll never forget where he came from. Tonight, I kept that promise. As I turned to leave, I felt the eyes of the room follow me, not with pity, not with disdain, but with something heavier, respect. They had seen the truth. They had watched a man who was supposed to be invisible stand tall in the one place they thought he had no place at all. I walked slowly toward the exit, my knees aching, my heart reminding me of its weakness with every beat. But I didn't feel weak. For the first time in years, I felt strong. I wasn't the burden. I wasn't the ghost in Ryan's story. I was the foundation he had tried to bury. Outside, the night air was cool against my face. The noise of the ballroom faded behind me, replaced by the hum of city traffic and the muffled cheers of people still watching the Super Bowl on giant screens across the street. The world kept moving, as it always does. But inside me, something had settled. I thought of Margaret. I imagined her standing beside me, her hand slipping into mine the way it used to when Ryan played his first Little League games. She would have been proud, not of the exposure, not of the contracts I revealed, but of the fact that I finally spoke when silence was no longer enough. I didn't destroy Ryan tonight.
He did that himself, with every denial of his roots, with every word that cut me down in public, with every time he erased his mother from his story. All I did was remind the world of what was real. As I walked down the steps of that hotel, I heard my name called faintly behind me. Ryan's voice. It wasn't the confident tone of an NFL star, but the broken murmur of a son who had finally seen the truth. I didn't turn around, not because I hated him, I never could, but because this wasn't the time for forgiveness. Not yet. I stepped into the night, my body frail, my heart tired, but my spirit lighter than it had been in decades. For years, I had lived in the shadow of my own silence. Tonight, I left that shadow behind. The world would move on, the sponsors would drop him, the headlines would twist, Victor would scramble to save what little was left, and Ryan would have to face himself, not the self-made man he bragged about, but the son of a mother who died believing in him and a father who carried him on his shoulders through fire and debt. As for me, I had nothing more to prove. I had spoken the truth. I had honored Margaret. I had kept my promise. And in that, I found peace.